The Toronto Raptors have one of the more disappointing seasons, falling well below expectations. A team that had this incredible run at the end of the year last season, going from being lottery bound to finishing 5th in the Eastern Conference and even giving the Sixers a run for their money, taking them to 6 games in the first round before being eliminated. And going into this season, there were some analysts and media outlets that had predicted the Raptors would finish top 4 in the Eastern Conference. None of the major pundits had the Raptors missing the playoffs or even finishing below the 7th seed. But after an inconsistent year that saw the Raptors go back and forth between having great games to really bad games where they just collapsed late in game, some of which were against really bad teams like the Magic, the Wizards, the Pacers, and while the Raptors ultimately finished 9th in the Eastern Conference to get them a shot at making it into the playoffs by way of the play-in, they eventually became the first 9 seed to lose on their own home court and be eliminated from playoff contention. So it begs the question for Raptors fans: what's next for this team, and what do they need to do to get back to contention after having just won a championship 4 years ago? If you're new to the channel and you like this type of content, be sure to subscribe, that way you don't miss a video, as it means a great deal to me, and really appreciate all the love and support on the channel since starting it at the beginning of this season. Now, there were a lot of teams in the NBA this year that fell below expectations. I don't want to just single out the Raptors here. The Mavericks had a horrible season. Even my Chicago Bulls, they were disappointing. The Timberwolves, especially after going all in on Rudy Gobert. Same with the Atlanta Hawks and that push that they made for DeJounte Murray. So I don't want this to come off like the Raptors were the only team that failed this season. Far from it. But the biggest difference with the Raptors here, and it was actually very similar to the Bulls, is unlike some of these other teams who made big splashes in the offseason to beef up their roster, the Raptors didn't really do that. For the most part, they chose to keep their team intact, re-sign most of their free agents, didn't make any big trades. They decided to run it back and keep their core together, which, why wouldn't they? With the way they finished off the season last year, a season where most people thought they were going to be lottery bound with how competitive the Eastern Conference was, instead they hit on the draft and getting Scotty Barnes, who ends up becoming Rookie of the Year. Pascal Siakam has this incredible season in which he gets selected to an All-NBA team. Fred VanVleet gets selected to his first All-Star game. OG Anunoby starts breaking out into this phenomenal two-way player. Like, there was no reason for the Raptors to make drastic changes to their roster when they played so well and still had the potential to get even better with some of their younger players continuing to improve. That is, unless you have the opportunity to trade for Kevin Durant. Now, these were always just rumors. It was never confirmed, but they came from pretty reliable sources in the NBA media that the Raptors were nearing a trade for Kevin Durant back in the offseason when KD first requested a trade. And it was reported that what held up the trade and keeping the Raptors from pulling the trigger is they wanted Scotty Barnes, who had just come off this great rookie season and had shown future star potential. And Masai Ujiri said, no thanks. Now, I'm sure there was more to it than just Scotty Barnes holding up the deal. I'm sure the Nets were looking for some considerable draft compensation, and by including Barnes in the deal as well, it just became too much for an aging Kevin Durant on a max contract. So you can't fault the Raptors for being unwilling to make any drastic changes in the offseason, especially if the price for Kevin Durant was too high. But then, going into the season, something was just off about this team that we didn't see last year. They weren't playing with the same level of energy on a nightly basis. Their shooting dropped pretty substantially, especially their outside shooting going down 10% from the prior year in three-pointers made. Scotty Barnes fell into a bit of a sophomore slump, wasn't as efficient as his rookie year, wasn't crashing the boards like we saw him do in his rookie season. And while I still think Barnes has a lot of upside potential, given he's only 21 years old, seeing him regress in his second year does have to be a bit concerning if you're the Raptors. Fred VanVleet also regressed after having an all-star season the year prior. Gary Trent Jr., while he had a decent season, was very inconsistent at times. That was even the case for Pascal Siakam as well. And what really started the downward spiral for the Raptors on the season was when they went on that 6-game losing streak where they lost back-to-back games to the Magic to start that streak. That was back in December. The Raptors never really recovered after that stretch. They never managed to string enough wins together consistently, and at that point it should have been made clear to the Raptors front office, yeah, we need to make some changes. This team is not it. And with the way the Eastern Conference was going, being more competitive than it ever has, at least at that time anyway, they had to think we could very well miss the playoffs if we don't do anything. So of course, a lot of trade rumors ensued. OG Anunoby was in a lot of trade talks, which never made sense to me because he's one of the few bright spot players on that team, one of the better two-way players in the league. Fred VanVleet was in trade rumors as well, same with Gary Trent. Like most had assumed going into the trade deadline, the Raptors were going to be sellers, that they would look to blow things up, try and start fresh, get some younger talent, maybe build some draft capital. But instead, they ended up being buyers at the deadline, only making one trade and acquiring Jakob Poeltl for Khem Birch, a first-round pick in 2 seconds. And look, I actually like Poeltl. I've said before, I think he's one of the more underrated bigs in the league with great rim protection and ability to finish at the rim. But for the Raptors, to get another big man, when they were already log-jammed in the front court as it is, a big who doesn't shoot threes and can't space the floor for a team that was already bereft of floor spacing and three-point shooting, you added Poeltl of all people. And again, this was a buying move. You moved draft assets to get Jakob Poeltl when everyone thought the Raptors could potentially be going on a fire sale, breaking up their core, or at least Fred VanVleet and OG Anunoby, since they were the most often in trade rumors. Nope. The only change they made was bringing in Jakob Poeltl to fill that starting center spot. And while the Raptors were okay post-trade deadline, they didn't really improve all that much in making that final playoff push. Again, ultimately finishing 9th, and they got eliminated from the play-in on their own home court to the Bulls. And this was after having a 19-point lead in the third quarter in that game. Now, a lot of people have asked, what went wrong this season for the Raptors? Well, I would say it's a lot of things. Not having enough shooting in a league that is predicated on outside shooting, too many front court players and not enough guards to match the small ball play of their opponents, not a good enough defensive rebounding team. And I emphasize defensive rebounding because they were actually a very good offensive rebounding team. But their inability to crash the boards on defense enabled their opponent to get way too many second chance opportunities. Like, all of these things are problems, but the biggest thing that stands out to me, and it's probably being overlooked, is the fact that Nick Nurse, who I still think is a great coach by the way, relies way too heavily on his best players, playing them way too many minutes, and that mileage from the prior season and the season before that caught up with the Raptors. And it didn't help that he continued to overplay them this season as well. Pascal Siakam led the league in minutes per game this year. Fred VanVleet was 5th in minutes in the NBA, and OG Anunoby 16th. Scotty Barnes was right up there as well, being in the top 25. And then you look at the playing game versus the Bulls. Nurse more or less played his starters the entire game. Siakam, Anunoby, Fred VanVleet all played 42 minutes, Barnes 40 minutes, and Poeltl 37. The only player off the bench that got any meaningful minutes in that game was Gary Trent, and he still only played 17 minutes. You just can't run your players into the ground like that and not expect there to be a breaking point where the players aren't going to bring the same level of energy on a nightly basis. And again, I love Nick Nurse. I think he's one of the better coaches in the NBA, but he has lost the locker room with that roster, and it's becoming abundantly clear that he's not the right man for the job in Toronto anymore. I do think he will be let go. I don't doubt that he'll get another job right away. There is talk about the Rockets going after him or being interested in acquiring him. But as far as changes and what's next for the Raptors, that's the first thing that needs to happen. They need to make a coaching change. And it's very possible by the time you're watching this, he's already been fired. But as a whole, when we talk about what's next for the Toronto Raptors, I think it's pretty clear that the core they have in place, that they've had in place for a number of seasons, needs to break up. You can call it blowing up the roster or retool, whatever, but the continuity and running it back and keeping this group together isn't going to work anymore, even under a new coach. And the biggest problem for the Raptors is they have little to no cap space flexibility, even with the salary cap increases going into effect next season. They have Siakam still on the books next season for near $38 million. OG Anunoby, they have him on the books for the next 2 seasons at close to $19 million, although the second season is a player option for him. Both Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent Jr., they have player options for this upcoming season, so if they decline those options, that actually would free up enough salary cap space to sign a big name, maybe like a Kyrie Irving, even though I think that would be a horrible decision. But outside of that, there aren't really that many big names for this upcoming free agency. And I have a hard time seeing Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent declining their player options. Maybe VanVleet because he has expressed a desire for a bigger, longer-term contract, and I don't know if the Raptors are going to be willing to give that to him. But given his performance this season and how things went down for the Raptors, I don't think there are going to be a lot of teams chomping at the bit to give Fred VanVleet a big payday. Thus, I think both of those guys will exercise their player options. And if that happens, I think they need to trade one of them. Probably VanVleet because you'll likely get more in return for him. But the biggest move the Raptors need to make to really accelerate a rebuild is by trading Pascal Siakam. Look, I know he's their best player. He means a ton to that organization, and being a homegrown draft pick that was a late first rounder and blossomed into this star, breaking out in that season in which they won the championship. And I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate from Raptors fans for even suggesting this, but trading Siakam is going to be their best course of action and starting over fresh, because with the current trade market and landscape of the NBA and teams shelling out multiple first-round picks for star-level players, you can get a pretty sizable haul for someone like Pascal Siakam, who is in his prime, can give you scoring, rebounding, and passing. Solid defense as well. And he's going to be on an expiring deal, which can sometimes make it easier to trade so teams don't feel like they're locking themselves into a long-term contract and can have the flexibility to negotiate their own contract extension with said player. By trading Siakam, I would say at a minimum, you can get 3 first-round picks and maybe even a young player or 2 with some upside. I mean, if we're purely going off of what the Spurs got for DeJounte Murray and the Jazz for Rudy Gobert, even though I think we can all agree those both were overpays, but those trades set the market rate for all-star players. And Siakam is arguably better than both of those guys in terms of his all-around skill set. I think getting back 3 first-round picks in return for him is fair value. Now, I know some will say, just trade OG. He even expressed he wasn't happy in Toronto anyway, but I feel like OG is a guy you have to hang on to. Given his age, his growth and maturation since entering the league, I see a lot of potential with him. Unless, of course, you get an insane haul that is just too good to pass up. Like if some team wants to ship out 3 first-round picks for OG Anunoby, yeah, you do it. As good as OG is, he's not an all-star. Maybe he will be in the future, but 3 first-round picks for OG, you jump on that all day. And then the Raptors need to decide what they want to do with all of their bigs. Poeltl is set to become a free agent. Do they re-sign him? What do they do with Thaddeus Young's partially guaranteed deal? Precious Achiuwa, do they look to move him before he becomes a restricted free agent? Same with Christian Koloko. Do they hang on to Chris Boucher after signing him to that 3-year deal and then not really playing him afterwards? There are just a lot of unknowns, a lot of decisions to make, and it starts with letting Nick Nurse go and really breaking up this core, starting with moving on from Siakam, likely trading Van Fleet as well if he exercises his player option. Get as much trade capital or young players as you can in return for your highest valued assets who are also taking up a lot of money on your cap sheet. Start fresh, rebuild. Those are just my thoughts though. Let me know what you guys think. What are the next steps for the Raptors? As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.